I was like 6 foot probably, and I couldn't. There you go.
All right, hello everyone. Thank you all so much for coming out tonight and braving this never-ending monsoon. We're so excited to be here with you all. My name is Amali and I'm the events director here at Books Are Magic. We are so pleased to have Lisa Coe and Melissa Rivera with us tonight to celebrate the launch of Lisa's newest novel, Memory Peace. But before we get started, I just have a few logistics to go over for how tonight's event is going to go. First off, we will be doing a hand-raised audience Q&A towards the end of the discussion, so please start thinking of questions to ask and hold on to them. After the talk tonight, Lisa will be around to sign and personalize your books. That will be happening at the alcove next to where you're checked in, and we'll let you know where and when to start lining up for that. And lastly, if you're joining us virtually on the YouTube live stream, we would love to encourage you to buy a copy of Memory Peace online using the link in the live stream description. Now, a bit about tonight's book. Memory Peace follows 3 friends through the 1990s and the 2000s and into the future 10 years from now, exploring the boundaries of art and activism in an increasingly digitized world. C-Pam Zhang calls Memory Peace bright with defiance, intelligence, and stubborn love, and says to spend time with these characters is a gift, as it is to spend time with the writer behind them. Lisa Coe is the author of the nationally best-selling novel, The Leavers, which was a finalist for the National Book Award for Fiction and the Penn Hemingway Award. Coe's short fiction has appeared in the Best American Short Stories, and her essays and nonfiction have been published in the New York Times and The Believer. As I mentioned earlier, Melissa Rivera joins us tonight in conversation. Melissa is the author of the novels Flores and Miss Paula and The Affairs of the Falcons, which won the 2019 New American Voices Award and a 2020 International Latino Book Award. Born in Lima, Peru, and raised in Brooklyn, she's a graduate of NYU and Brooklyn Law School, where she was an editor of the Brooklyn Law Review. She now lives in New York City with her family. Okay, that's all for me. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Lisa and Melissa.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? Thank you so much for coming out tonight on this disgusting night. I just learned this, but I guess part of the ratification of the universe is now the weather is rated. And today's weather was rated 0 out of 10. Feels very appropriate. So thanks for being here. Thank you to Books Are Magic, and thank you to Melissa for stepping in to do this event with me. If you all haven't read Flores and Miss Paula, you should definitely pick it up. So I'm going to start by reading a few pages from Memory Peace, and then we'll get into our conversation, and we'll have time at the end for your questions. So Memory Peace follows 3 friends over the span of 60 years. Performance artist Giselle Chin, tech coder Jackie Ong, and housing activist Ellen Eng. And it also looks at how their ambitions and interests are also really deeply intertwined in tech and art, and also in activism, and how those things in the 90s ended up foreshadowing how we live now and how we might live in the future. So I'm going to read from part of Giselle's section. The book is roughly divided into 3 sections, and this is she's an aspiring conceptual artist, and here she's trying out some failed pieces of early work. After high school, Giselle signed up for classes at Bergen Community College and quit before her 2nd semester. That winter, she moved into the top floor of a crumbly house in Hoboken with her friend Sherilyn, whom she'd met while selling shoes at Garden State Plaza, and Sherilyn's friends Carmen and Miles. She got a new job at a copy store, walking distance from the apartment. Giselle's room was the smallest and crappiest, with 2 doors on opposite walls, doors through which other people frequently passed on their way to other rooms. And for this, she paid the cheapest rent. It was the start of a new decade, 1990. In the apartment, no matter how late she fell asleep, she woke early, 6:30, 7. She appreciated regimen, routine and order, that precious window of time when everything was quiet. She sat in bed, pulling the sheets around her, and retrieved her notebook and markers to write about the day before. She sketched her friends, kept lists of shows she saw, people she fooled around with, movies watched. If you did not maintain the days, what proof would you have of your existence, of time passing? When she got home from work, there were people in the living room passing around Miles's bong. You mean you haven't even seen Repo Man, one of them said, a girl whose voice resembled a goose. A pepperoni pizza lay ravaged on the table, leaking oil on a Snapple bottle stuffed with cigarette butts. Giselle dreamt of space, in her head and her surroundings. Her parents were pissed at both their kids for not furthering their educations. Alexander had moved to Florida with friends and gotten a job at a gym. Her mother, Mercy, called to voice her concern, long messages on the answering machine that Giselle tried to erase before her roommates could hear. Your mom's really worried about you, Carmen said. But spending 4 years at college just to get a job you hated seemed like a waste of time and money. On the floor of her room, materials strewn out in front of the bed, Giselle assessed a piece she was working on, a diced-up tourism photo with a diced-up slogan, Lover, you fall up. From the living room came the sound of something crashing, followed by laughter. Her latest obsession was creating collages of cut-out women in ads and free newspapers, each woman composed of 10 or more different women. At work, between customer requests to collate a textbook and fix a jammed machine, she layered and copied the collages, the copies copied until it was impossible to tell what the first image had been. It was technically fulfilling, but felt like routine action, like shitting or brushing your teeth. She could see a picture and reconstruct it in her mind, then produce that reconstruction. She wanted a challenge. On her day off, Giselle took the train into Manhattan. At MoMA, she saw a retrospective of a famous artist's work, his doodles and diary notes, a painting made with semen. The accompanying text, with phrases like aesthetic response and disseminating language, made the art seem more serious than it was. The artist had 3 wives. He was arrested for beating one. He was a heavy drinker prone to getting into fights. The guy jizzed into his paints, and now he was in a museum. This is true. Giselle wondered how important it was to have a complicated life in addition to making your art. She made her rounds on the other floors. She loved the Adrian Piper videos she saw from the 1970s, the artist walking around Manhattan in a wig and fake mustache, muttering lines from her journals as people pointed and gawked. The decaying footage felt archival and gluey, with a hint of the archaeological. Familiar streets as black and white relics. You made a thing and it slipped through her hands like toy slime, instantly of the past. She loved Gretchen Bender's riot of music and TV clips, mashed together and beamed onto 13 surround sound monitors, reminiscent of Giselle's own childhood VCR cuts. It was freeing, joyful, to let herself succumb to the wall of lights and noise. The Jenny Holzer slogans in all caps italics, subliminal in the repetition and sexily authoritarian. Giselle wanted to be able to replicate the feeling of seeing these pieces, but how? She wanted her work to provide a container for the uncertainty and overwhelm of the future, an expression of her concerns and a way to corral them. Circle piece, 1991. For 12 hours one Saturday, Giselle drew circles on a piece of poster board until her hand cramped and froze into a claw. At first, she felt uncomfortable, then enraged and gloriously empty, like the time she posed for a life drawing class at a community center, and the pain of holding herself still passed into a euphoric state of blankness. Coffee piece, 1991. Giselle went a week without coffee and thought she would die. But even though her head ached and she fell asleep at work, there was a lightness, a barbed pleasure. Nothing could control her except herself. Maybe this was what her mother had felt when she didn't eat full portions, or what you were supposed to feel when you prayed, the accomplishment of discipline. She didn't want to think about her mother. Diet piece, 1992. For 1 week, Giselle ate nothing but No Frills brand cottage cheese until she puked so violently her roommates made her Clorox the bathroom. Miles said, "Can you make less gross art next time?" Now, even thinking of cottage cheese made her stomach tighten. I'll leave you with that beautiful image.
That was great. And that's how we start to see. Oh, there's more seats up here.
Oh yeah, there's a whole front row.
start to see where Giselle's obsessions are or lie, right? The experience of creating art in that way, right? Giselle is one of three characters we see in this beautiful novel that really make, at least when I was reading it, I started to not question so much as be like, yes, I agree with Giselle so much of what is happening in these pages. But it's Giselle, Jackie, and Ellen, which you had mentioned, and these three women meet when they're very young, right? They meet at a barbecue in Jersey in the 80s. And then we see them grow as individuals, and then their relationship really changed over the course of decades. At times I did wonder if they would necessarily be friends as adults.
Right.
And so I was just curious as to, first of all, what was the inspiration for these characters, for each of them, but then also what is it specifically about their friendship and the continuity of their friendship that kept them engaged in their own, for lack of a better word, obsessions.
Right. Yeah, I think obsessions is a great way to put it. And I love obsessions too. I'm obsessed with obsessions and people's obsessions in real life and the ones I make up. But I started the book in the time after I sold The Leavers in 2016 and before it came out. So I think, people were like, you probably know this, like you finished your first book, it's time to get going on the second one. And I was just thinking a lot about like how to make art under capitalism, which I know that we've talked about a lot. We've been friends for a long time and have written together for a long time. And I don't know, I was just sort of reminiscing about being a child making art before I knew what art was, and just like having these, I don't know, like childhood collaborators where we like really got each other and we would just be really creative, and it was a time before you were even thinking about like your career, like, money or book deals and all that stuff. And I think I just wanted to like explore like what you mentioned, the arc of a long friendship, right? And also the way that these friends, also like you mentioned, who might not necessarily have so much in common as they grow older, but I think we all have these friends that you share these experiences with and influence one another deeply and stay connected even if though you're not physically connected. So I started with Jackie and Giselle. And I also just really wanted to write about women who were obsessed with their work, with their creative work and their ambitions, and have it to be less about like who are they going to marry or who are they going to be in a relationship with, but rather about the choices that they would make and would have to make to do the work they love and to be free to do the work they love, and also how they impact one another's choices. So I think Ellen as the third character, who as a young person is sort of, like slightly obnoxious, I think, in her activism and her kind of, binary thinking around there's one right way to do things, but she sort of provides this kind of moral mirror to Jackie and Giselle. Like they're both always being like, would Ellen be happy with this choice?
There's no ambiguity with her.
There's no ambiguity with her until she gets older.
Right.
Like many of us. So yeah, in a way, I kind of wanted them to all explore the question of like what it meant to be true to yourself and if that was even possible.
Yeah. And then what I also found very interesting was the time frame. I mean, as you mentioned, we're talking about 60 years, essentially, right? The 80s till the 2040s. Yeah. Why did you choose that time frame? It's like the lifespan of a human being.
It's lifespan, yeah, and probably of us.
Yeah.
Not to be morbid, but yeah, I think like whenever you're writing about the past, it's inevitable that I start thinking about like what's changed since then, like how did we get from then to now, and what's changed over time. And of course, I share, a lot of the demographics of my characters. I was also born in the mid-70s. I, was raised in the 80s with this, Reagan era kind of American exceptionalism and all the propaganda we got in school. moved to New York City in the 90s, worked in the early .com industry like Jackie. And then I just feel like from the standpoint of being in my 40s and, the past years that we've all had, like, it's easy to see all the interlocking crises that we're facing and like how they might play out, whether it's climate and, what's going on out there, and like scarcity, policing, militarization. And I kind of wanted the book's structure to mimic that experience of living in New York specifically throughout that period of time. So moving from this kind of mundane suburban setting, where, I don't know, it's just like childhood interests like TV and going to the mall and meeting with your friends, to this very compressed moment around Y2K when there was this very absurd tech optimism rush in the city. And Jackie's section is written in present tense, and like the stakes feel really high about, are these companies going to sell or not? And it's all extremely ridiculous. And then Ellen's section, which is in 2041, which is actually only 17 years away from now, so it's the same amount of time between now and 2007, is sort of, was written sort of like towards my own anxiety about staying in New York or leaving New York. Like, I think it's a very New York novel, and New York in a way is like a microcosm of the larger US political economy. And I know you've been in New York for most of your life, we've seen how weird the city has become, or like how like unrecognizable it is. Like, I just, like, sometimes I'm in Manhattan and I'm like, what is this? Like, why are these buildings here? Why do they look like this? It's so wrong. So I think Ellen's section is trying to mimic that like kind of frog in boiling water experience of just being like years pass and all of a sudden it's like, where am I and what's happened to the world around me? And like, how did we get to where we are?
Right. Yeah, and you're right. I mean, it's not just Manhattan, but I'm sure
All of it.
Brooklyn, all of it,
Yeah.
right? Like, I remember I could see the sky once upon a time,
The
like,
sky.
in Greenpoint.
Yeah.
Now I
Yeah.
can't.
You can even
anymore.
walk to the water.
No,
now
yeah,
you can't.
no, for sure. And speaking about communities, the communities that these women create for themselves, at times feels like it's also kind of like the communities that their parents created. I mean, there's this one line very early on, I think it's probably on the first page, where the barbecue is a reunion for the students who used to go to this Chinese school.
Right.
And you say, or the narrator says, their differences have been flattened by proximity of exile, which is a beautiful line. And in some ways, in many ways actually, these characters felt like they themselves have been exiled. Whether that's because they chose to follow what they're passionate about, which goes just so contrary to what society tells them that they need to do, or because the actual thing that they've chosen to do is so isolating in many ways, right? Like Jackie focusing on her software program, and Giselle focusing on like her art. The art that she creates is very just like her experience. Really, only she can experience what she's doing in many ways. Ellen with like her the squatting, right? Like, sort of isolating herself from the community that's changing in so many ways around her. In what ways, I was just curious, do you see a difference between the ways in which these women's family, in which those families found community, and the ways in which they themselves find it as adults?
I like that parallel. Like, I don't think I ever really thought about it until you mentioned it. I don't know. Yeah, it's interesting because it talks to about how like community is both circumstantial or also by choice, but at the end of the day, both of those things speak to like our innate need for community, right? And it made me think of like around the scenes where the girls are meeting in Chinese school and they wouldn't normally be friends except they're in immigrant families here in the same region, so they're kind of thrown together. Like my mom like moved from Queens, where I was born, to a predominantly white suburb in New Jersey, and like made friends by cold calling the families with Asian last names in the phone book.
Oh, wow.
Like that's what we did, like in like the early '80s, and like so my family had this group of friends times that these people would never ever hang out like in their home countries. Like it was like a Thai family, a Japanese family, like like my parents, like Chinese Filipinos. So yeah, and also what you said about the three characters, like they're all, I don't know, even if it's like an online community or like an artistic lineage or literally building this cooperative living model that Ellen does, they're all kind of always seeking that sense of belonging. And yeah, also I think the book, I don't know, there's definitely like a sense of like queerness in the way that they all seek out and create their own like chosen families and like different ways of living, and different relationships. Anyway, yeah, I don't know. I think in a way like both writing the book kind of drew from my own experiences of community, but also reminded me to prioritize it in my own life. Like I think the narrative of capitalism is that we're all like competing for scarcity together, right? And we're all isolated and we can't trust each other, right? But obviously, collective action is the antidote to dread. And I think that's kind of what the book is ultimately pointing towards, like this, I don't know, like the Grace Lee Boggs teaching of like transform yourself to transform the world, right? And like that the daily practice of liberation can be done through your relationships and through yourself and through your friends and your work. And I think that's what the characters are doing as well.
I'd like to talk a little bit about Giselle's work.
Yes.
Her pieces are very interesting on many levels. I don't know how she would. I don't want to spoil anything, but there are certain pieces that I'm just like, I would never even go in there.
Yeah.
In broad
There's a
daylight.
lot of logistics.
Like, yeah, it's just I don't know how she does it. But what I was really curious about is like, what drew you to that specific form of art for her, like that experiential aspect of it, because it's so challenging for the individual, and
Right.
I'm just curious as to why that was the thing that Giselle did.
Right. Yeah, she does. I feel like I don't really know how to describe it. I feel like she's like a conceptual endurance artist or whatever the term is. And I guess it's always like it's been like a form of art I've also always been fascinated by. I think just I don't know, growing up as a deeply anxious child, becoming a deeply anxious adult, always like worried. I know we talked about this, like about like wasting time and using my time correctly and what am I doing with my time, and like there's artists like Ankawara, this Japanese artist who painted the date every day on a different painting for 50 years. Like I don't know, there's just such a discipline to it and a regularity, and as somebody who was like a daily journal keeper for decades, like it really appealed to me. And Giselle's work in particular and her performance pieces are definitely inspired by the Taiwanese artist Taixing Shea, who does he's best known for these they're all like a year-long pieces in the 70s and 80s. One of them he lives in a cage by choice for a year. Another one he's like tied to another artist with a rope for a year. There's one where he punches a time clock every hour for a year. And I feel like when I first heard about these, I was kind of like, what the fuck? Like, how could you waste years of your life? Not only 1 year, but like 5 years doing this shit. Like, that's wild. Like, what a choice, right? What a choice. But it's also, I don't know, it's also like really interesting because it like kind of subverts the idea that like artwork and real work are not the same, which I've always struggled with, right? And like, and like, what's the best way to use your time, and so it's literally making the passage of time the art itself, like wasting time is the point. So I think Giselle's art practice is in a way trying to solve her own problems around like art making under capitalism, right? So she does a kind of satirical piece where she decides to live in a mall, the Prems Park Mall, my home mall in New Jersey, for a year. And it solves her problem of like trying to find funding to make art, or like, she has to work a lot to pay rent, but then she doesn't have time for work, for a project. So, I'll just solve this problem by like living rent-free in a secret room in a mall. Like, and she's sort of asking this question of like, well, number one, if no one knows about it, doesn't matter. And number two, like, is this really is a better way to spend a year, like doing an office job as a secretary, which is what she was doing before, or like, sitting on my ass watching TV in my apartment, is one more valued than the other, and why? It's just another year of your life. So.
Is that your favorite piece?
I mean, I do love the pyramid smell just because it's the pyramid smell. The Orange Julius. I don't want to give it away, but I do think my favorite piece might be Disappearance piece. Yeah, but if you read it, you can know.
Mine is a different one, but I don't want to ruin it.
Oh, yeah, I want to talk about it.
All right, so a little bit about Jackie. So she's like a character that's very familiar to me. Like I feel like I know Jackie's, but she's
Having worked at a startup.
yeah. But she is so preoccupied with both her office job, like her day job, and her program, right? So she delivers. Am I spoiling it? I say like she works for like a delivery service, like basically order stuff and someone will get it for you.
It's like Cosmo.com in the 90s, if anyone remembers that. It was like the pre-Uber Eats.
Yeah. Yes. And she's conflicted about working at this job, but she also kind of sees this bigger goal in mind regarding her program that she's, her software program. So I was just curious if you feel that in her case, or really in any case, do the ends justify the means? In other words, like, and you touched on this before, like, we're always sort of compromising, right, as artists in many ways. So at what, is there a tipping point and for that compromise between our goals and our values?
I mean, that's a hard question to answer. But it is something we've talked about very recently as well. There's like seats up here if you want to sit. What was I gonna say? I don't know. It's interesting because I think some of the questions that Jackie confronts, or Ellen kind of forces Jackie to confront as young people in the late 90s, are pretty antiquated now, right? And the sort of that generation's preoccupation with like selling out, or like the idea that there's like a moral purity, I just feel like, I don't know, don't really compute anymore, right? Like the choices are different. I think there's fewer choices. I think it's harder to live, and there's less of a like alternative infrastructure, right? And like in some ways we're all selling out and compromising every day, from using iPhones to like we live here in the U.S. in like the heart of the empire, and like we're doing like violence is being done to us, and we're doing violence to other people, right? So there's, I don't know, right? Like it's like we're all sort of implicated, but I guess I'm also interested in like what it does to us. Like how does living here like affect our bodies and our minds, and like what does it feel to carry that dissonance with us like every day? And I don't think there's like a perfect answer in terms of like what to do regarding goals versus values, but maybe there's layers of answers, right? And I think the novel's looking at that as well.
No, for sure, and I think that Jackie really makes you think about that in a much, at least for me, in a much deeper way, Again, I don't want to spoil it, but like it's, like I really felt it in reading her chapters in particular. And so then we come to Ellen, who takes us into this bleak but not necessarily impossible future, right? And it's a future that she fears, but also one that she very much sees coming.
Right.
She's a realist. And we have this, can I say what kind of world we're living in now? It's very much like the surveillance state that is segregated in a variety of ways. And we see Ellen standing up for what she believes is right, sort of throughout the novel. And for better or for worse, nothing really changes. And so this made me wonder, are we just doomed to a future that we can plainly see? You know what I mean? Like, and despite our efforts to change course, that's just, it is what it is, So
what's the point, Lisa?
What
is the point? Yeah, right. That's a good. What is the point? Might be a little harder to answer.
Well, like, is there anything that is there like really anything that can be done to change, right? I mean, like, that's kind of, and it's not a question for you to answer. It's just a question that's just like,
well, yeah, it like speaking about that future too. I think is also interesting because it's on one hand it's being, I don't know, it's being positioned as something that's like dystopian, right? But on the other hand, it's like totally like the world we're living in now. Like all of it is exactly like it's just like there's surveillance, there's drones, there's like we're funding AI technology and genocide. Like the cops are surveilling us with like drones all the time. And so there's media suppression on on and on. So I feel like that future is sort of, I don't know, it's like the status quo. It's what happens if the status quo continues, right? And I don't think it's inevitable, but I also feel like anything else demands like imagination, right? And like not accepting like not accepting like normality as inevitable, right? Like this idea that
or complacency,
or
right?
complacency,
Yeah.
like there's a complacency I think in
Yeah,
normality, or I think that was something that was tossed around a lot with the pandemic about like going back to normal, like that means kind of like accepting that all this stuff is inevitable. But I don't know, and I think too, and this was something I thought about while writing like Ellen's section is like, what is that change? Like I think we like obviously I think we are the change, right? And then like and that we could use our like fear and our anger to drive us towards action, but that can also take so many different forms. Like, and I think we're also, I don't know, there's like, this is off topic, but I feel like we're sold this sanitized narrative of like political movement, like the kind of like Marvel universe political movement of like there's an exceptional leader who's like charismatic and will have a light bulb moment, and the rest of us are just gonna sit on our hands and await direction, and like everything is meaningless unless it's like massive, and I think that is like for us to feel powerless, right? And even like massive change consists of like millions of kinds of small actions. Anyway, so
One of which is creating art.
Which is creative art, yeah.
Right.
And I think for Ellen, like that's something that her character like experiences on her journey where she's in her 70s and sort of feeling this sense of disconnection with all the work that she's done over the years. Like was there a point is something that she's asking like herself and her friends. And in a way, I do think that the book ends like on a hope, like a note of hope, insofar as it's like reclaiming like memories and like reclaiming the importance of her work and its significance to be able to just dream about what can come next. Yeah. I think that answers.
All right, I have just a couple of nerdy questions if we still have time before we get into the audience questions. Okay, so question number one. The novel is divided into 6 parts. I know there's like 3 real like sections, but
okay, so you're seeing the other, right?
Yes, the others, right. Curious as to how you came to that structure.
Oh wow, that's a good question. I think it's interesting to reflect on like how anything happens because it was never linear and it was never on purpose, and I think of like I kind of like in my writing process as like I had a rat in a former apartment in Brooklyn years ago, and I found out that it was like living in our walls and it was taking little bits of like dirt from our houseplants and like fabric and building a nest and living and chilling in the walls.
Yes, I remember this.
Oh, you remember this, right? So sorry to interrupt again, but like I feel like I think like I'm like my writing process is being that rat. Like so I'm just like taking all the shit from like wherever and then like smuggling it back to my desk. And, like, doing that for like 5 to 7 years. And I email my agent. So yeah, I don't know. I feel like they can. Like it was just a process of like writing a lot of scenes and then realizing like the arc of each of the characters, and then wanting each of them to sort of represent like a different time period and also like a different like pillar of industry, right? And then I think the other sections like the interstitials kind of form like another narrative that in a way the book, this probably doesn't make sense unless you read it, but like Ellen is sort of the protagonist of the book who's receiving like a message from Jackie and Giselle, whether it's literal or not, to sort of don't know, kind of give her her memories back and give her a direction moving forward. So yeah, that was sort of through many, many, many different experimentations and tries and starts and stops
Got it.
in my records. Yeah.
Okay, characters, scenes, and then the structure, essentially, right?
Yeah, for this one.
Yeah. So you shift, and you mentioned this before, how Jackie's chapters are in present tense, so there's this immediacy to it. And you shift between different POVs, throughout the novel. And how did you decide which one best suited each of the characters?
Right. I wanted each section to have a distinctly different style. And I think partly that was also in my desire to have it mimic that experience of moving through time, right? So Giselle's section, I think, hopefully they choose this, is like written in this artist biography style with a lot of kind of discrete paragraphs and scenes, third person, talking about her as kind of like a character and like her development as an artist. And then Jackie's is a lot more compressed, right, and faster moving to sort of mimic the environment that she's in during, the year basically of 1999 to 2000, working in the tech industry. And then, yeah, I don't know, I think eventually, like, Ellen was sort of a character that showed up later in the process. Like, she was always there as a friend and as like a buddy, but then about 2 years in, I realized she was the third main character, and I realized that the first person was just the right place for her. That the book was kind of hers in a way, like I think she's like her journey is sort of the journey of the book. If that makes sense.
No, it does. And then, so you started with Jackie and Giselle first. Just curious.
Yeah.
Giselle or Jackie?
Both.
Oh, okay. Okay. Okay, you don't outline it,
No. I mean, I wish. It sounds great. I do some of that stuff later. I feel like I have to like do all the collecting and like overwriting, and then eventually I feel like I have enough to do that. Or like I work with index cards a lot and like post-it notes and things like that.
Okay. I have just one final question, and then we'll move on to Q&A.
Yeah.
What are you reading now?
Oh, what am I reading now? I'm reading Lucy Sant's I heard her call my name. That's what it's called. Yeah, it's a memoir. It's a memoir of her gender transition and just unreal. I mean, it's not the point of the book, but it also portrays like a very exciting New York City of the past, which I love. I'm like such a fan of her writing. But it makes me think of like as New Yorkers how like the time that we romanticize is always slightly out of reach. So like she's just writing about all this art and music in the 70s, like it sounds so cool. The nostalgia that doesn't ever really exist, Yeah.
All right, I think we'll move to Q&A now. I do need to repeat the question, so just because I can hear you.
Yeah.
Sure. Yes.
Hello, my name is Joseph, and my question is, there's the section for the 2041. Did you read any books about the future, and if so, what were they?
The question is, for the sections that take place in the year 2041, did Lisa read any books to inform those sections?
I love the idea that we could read a book about the future in order to like fact check the future. If only it was possible. I mean, I often felt nervous about writing about the future because what if you get it really wrong, I mean, and you don't find out for another 17 years. Your book's probably out of print by then anyway, so. Anyway, I do find myself drawn to, some, I don't know, speculative futury stuff. Like I love Severance by Ling Ma. Sequoia Nagamatsu's book is like phenomenal. I don't know if they were necessarily read as like research to inform the book. I think the future is really deeply informed by the present, honestly, so more about like reading about surveillance and like reading about gentrification, and then sort of drawing that path from where we are now.
I have two questions, if I can just ask them like one by one.
Yeah.
That's okay. Okay. One is, I think it was really interesting listening to you talk about how the three characters were formed over time. Curious if you want to talk more about what was maybe something like unexpectedly like delightful that sprung from working with a trio instead of a duo, and maybe some challenges that came from that.
Sure. So the question is, did anything exciting spring out of writing about 3 characters and their relationship?
I think definitely realizing that Ellen was the third main character was the biggest surprise. I was kind of I was like very happy and also very unhappy to figure it out because I had to then write it. So yeah, that was definitely one of those kind of organic discoveries. It's like this character is spending a lot of time, in my story. I guess I should probably listen to that. And so yeah, it was. I think having that third it opens up the freedom to have the characters see one another and then show how the difference between how they see each other and how they see themselves, and you can do that in math 3 to 3, 9 different ways theoretically, right? Yeah.
And your second question? Yeah, my second question is, so you said you started this in 2016, 2017, but much has changed with the pandemic, with AI in the time since.
Right.
So I'm curious how those real world impacts have maybe changed, maybe the trajectory of your novel, or if you sort of came in already feeling like maybe those events reinforced what you were trying to write.
The question is, did any of the real world developments that have happened since Lisa started the novel in 2016, did that impact the writing of the novel, or did she go already into the writing of the novel with specific things in mind?
Right.
It did not change.
I think they both changed and didn't. They didn't change it literally, and I felt very strongly about not wanting to write about, say, the pandemic, because it's just too present, it's too recent, and a book is published 2 or 3 years after you finish writing it, it's too dangerous to write about something that's still ongoing at the time you're writing it. But I do think it did influence the book in some ways, I don't know, there was a year where all my local friends left, and left the neighborhood, left the city, and that ended up inspiring Ellen's section, because I was just what if I'm the last one in New York? Oh shit, so yeah, I think in ways that I didn't realize it did.
Thank you for your question.
Thank you.
Hey Lisa, it's Abby. Hi. So there's this. You had just been talking about how the way in which Jackie and Giselle in a way are kind of returning memories and the memories to Ellen in the end. And I was just thinking about this one passage where Ellen thinks about all the things that she's learned to forget. And it's this great passage, and you write, I had thought that America's obsession with forgetting its history, the whitewashing of its crimes, was a part of the crimes themselves. But there was another side of it, self-preservation. And it's sort of the ways that... So that just was so interesting that Ellen is the one who's Ellen ultimately is forgetting, needs to forget all these things in a way, and then Jackie and Giselle, whose careers seem different, but they've always been people sort of documenting things, how that comes together in the end, and they have something to offer Ellen. And of course the book's called Memory Piece. So I was just wondering if you could speak more to this theme of memory and when it's useful and when it's not, and sort of how that became important for you.
The question is, or the request is, can Lisa talk more about memory and writing about memory?
Sure. Yeah, thank you, and thank you for that question and for reading the passage. Yeah, I think it's a really important part of the book, obviously, and they're both, all 3 of the characters are dealing with memory in really distinct ways, whether it's recording it or creating, like Jackie does, software to collect and publish it. And just like you mentioned, for Ellen in her future scenes, memory is something that has become a liability where, you're kind of forced to forget. There's definitely censorship about the past and about what's actually happened, and then also you decide to forget on your own because remembering things can be painful, right? So yeah, I think it's sort of it's it becomes her work, like you mentioned, to sort of remember what she's lived through and what she's done, and that there was in some ways there was a point to it, and that allows her to I don't know, like there's a sense of like strength that she gains from remembering. Whether, it's not necessarily like a literal memory of like Giselle and Jackie's lives, but it kind of gestures towards that.
Hi,
Hi.
how are you?
Good. Good to see you.
Good to see you. I guess my question is, you said something really interesting at the beginning about how you wanted to write a book about 3 women that was not predominantly focused on their relationships with other partners or other people and everything. Can you talk a little bit more about why you felt that was like a hole in literature and how that was where you could, why that was such a meaningful thing for you to write about and create this world around these 3 powerful women who the core is their friendship, instead of, even most times it would be one of them was an antagonist and the other 2 were friends or something like that. Like why the core of having all 3 of them be friends?
The question is, can we talk more about wanting to focus on these 3 strong women and their friendship versus instead of their relationships to other people?
Right.
Yeah, I think it was just what I wanted to read, and I just wanted to write about like women, especially Asian women, getting to be art monsters. And we read so many stories about like, white men art monsters. I'm like, but we can be art monsters too, like, and I'm obsessed with, I'm a workaholic, like, like everyone I know is, I don't know, right? Like it's, so it's like, it's fun for me, I think, to think about those questions and to like use art to explore them. And yeah, I don't know. I think like the idea of like friendship and women's friendship is so it's so interesting, and there's like so much there. And it's also such a familiar part of our lives, right? And like those friendships are in some ways like, I don't know if they're more meaningful, but they can be like as significant, if not more significant, and longer lasting than many romantic relationships. So. And they also deeply, like interfere with our work and impact our work in different ways. So just writing about these kind of, these friends who are, very obsessed with their own creative work, but also each other's, felt just like a really interesting place to explore.
I was wondering, I haven't gotten a chance to read this book yet, and I'm really excited to do that. And I was just wondering, we've been talking about the section that's set in 2040, and it sounds like it has to do with like surveillance, and like as much as you can share for someone who's maybe going to read the book, like when you were writing that section, like did it approach like dystopian for you at all? Is that what that section is gonna be like, or maybe not so much?
Okay, the question is, can we talk about the sections that are written in 2040 and sort of surveillance state, if that's dystopian?
It's interesting because maybe it depends on your reaction to it, and also your definition of dystopian, right? And I think it's been interesting to me to hear different readers' reactions to that section, where some people are like horrified and were like, this could never happen. Like clearly some major apocalyptic event would have to happen for this to happen. And other people are like, well, this feels like tomorrow in New York City or yesterday. Like the National Guard's already in the subway. Like it's not much of a reach, So yeah, I don't know. So it's like both. In some ways, it's both like to me it feels like a realistic portrayal of the future, and kind of like a slightly softer version of the future. Like I actually think dystopia would be more violent than it is, and so it's a sense of the future that I think is both like making room for both reality and possibility. Yeah, but maybe when you read it, you can decide if it's like dystopian or not, according to what you think.
Can we do 2 more questions? Okay, all right. Okay.
So in, I think it's Jackie's section where, like, not a spoiler, it's kind of a minor thing, but Jackie and Ellen, I think, are speaking, and they're talking about Giselle's art. And there's at one point where Jackie is like, they're talking about how like Asian it is, and then Ellen is sort of just like, what the fuck are you talking about? Like she's just a girl from Jersey. And then later on, in Ellen's perspective, she says like a line that like really stuck with me a lot, is where she says, I've outgrown the need for like seeing Asian Americans in like movies as like my sole political identity. And I guess I wanted to ask about how you decided to build each of the characters' political identities, because I think like specifically with like Giselle and Jackie,
Right.
they're a little bit more subtle, and then Ellen is like a lot more forward and centered like politically. And I guess like how each of their political identities informed the others, sort of where they are like disparate, and sort of why it was important to you, I guess, to like make sure that like even though it is subtle in some parts, to like really have this exploration of like these political identities.
Okay, so the question is, can Lisa talk a little bit about the political identities of the characters? I mean, Ellen is great at calling everybody out.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. I feel like, yeah, I mean, I think it's completely central to them as characters, right? It's as central as like their families, their relationships, their work, their schooling. Like, it's so inseparable from who we are. And even like not having a political identity is obviously political stance, right? So it was a very deliberate decision, I think, to like, you know, have like Giselle kind of dealing with, you know, like the wealth and the whiteness of the art world, and like having access to that, and like what kind of compromises you have to make, you know, and Jackie in her own section as well. And yeah, I think throughout Ellen is sort of providing, like, she's making them feel insecure and uncomfortable because she's making them question themselves, right? You know, and it's also, it's like her political journey feels also like truthful to just the way that, I don't know, like, you know, identity politics and like politics in general have developed over the past 30 years, right? So there's, I think, specific things that she would say and like participate in 1999 that are really different than now, or like in 15 years, right? So it felt like a meaningful part of New York history, I think, in U.S. history, to write that into the story.
Hi. So you've talked about some artists and also some authors that kind of shaped us, but and the fact that it's about memory. I can't think of a more powerful medium other than music to take us back to a certain period of time, whether it was the 80s and the first section, 90s and so on. Did you create any kind of playlist to transport yourself amidst those index cards while you were focusing on certain sections?
The question is, did Lisa create a playlist in addition to her index cards as she was writing some of these sections? If there's a playlist, please
so
like drop the link.
I feel like I'm like, is this question a playlist? I definitely created playlists. Like, I have multiple ones. Some are based on actual mixtapes that I made in the 90s and I made in Spotify. You know, Spotify's evil. I'm compromising my values. I'm sorry. But they're definitely under my Spotify account. I am Lisa Co. There's 3 memory piece playlists you can find. There's also one up at largeheartedboy.com, which is a site full of author playlists about their books, which is really fantastic.
What's that site?
It's called largeheartedboy.com, and he basically publishes author playlists about their books. It's fascinating.
B-O-I or B-O-I?
B-O-I.com. Yes, so yes, playlists, yes, many. Thank you. All right, I think that's it.
That's it.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, there's no off switch. Thank you all so much for coming out tonight. Thank you to everyone who asked questions. Thank you to Melissa for moderating such a wonderful conversation. And thank you to Lisa for celebrating this rich, dynamic, fantastic book launch with us. So, just some final reminders before we wrap up. If you're still with us on the live stream, you can buy a copy of Memory Piece by clicking the link in the live stream description. For those of you with us tonight, if you haven't gotten a copy already, we've got plenty of additional books available for purchase at the front register where you checked in, along with some copies of Believers, Lisa's previous novel, and Melissa's most recent novel, Miss Flores and Miss Paula. I'm getting it all mixed up in my head. So I highly recommend checking those out as well. Lisa will be around to sign and personalize your books. Sarah Jane, would you mind pointing to the receiving desk? That's where that's going to be happening. It'll make more sense in a minute, but we just ask that you please gather all of your personal belongings, line up down the center aisle, and curve around to the door. or to the table, and that's all. Let's give these two one last round of applause.